So hi everyone, I'm Grace Blakeley. I'm a staff writer at Tribune magazine, who are co-sponsoring this event. And there should be a link that is popping up in the chat at some point for you to have a look at Tribune, and if you want to subscribe, and also to check out an article that Colin and Leo published with us on Tony Benn at 95 fairly recently. So enough about that. I am so glad this event is happening. I've been looking forward to this for ages. Oh wait, people are saying they can't hear me. James, have you unmuted me?
Yeah, I've unmuted you.
Okay, there's just two people who said they can't hear. They probably haven't figured it out right. Sorry guys, we're gonna have to go on without you. So yeah, I'm super excited this is happening because yeah, this book has been obviously in production for a while, and we were concerned that we might not be able to do the launch with this amazing panel, but I'm really glad that we've been able to. So we are obviously here to discuss Colin and Leo's new book, Searching for Socialism, the project of the Labour New Left from Benn to Corbyn. So this book builds on their famous book from 2000, The End of Parliamentary Socialism from the New Left to New Labour. And they've condensed that book to the first half of this book and then extended it to cover the last 20 years, including obviously the premiership of Jeremy Corbyn. And so yeah, I'm really excited to introduce our panel. We've got an incredible panel here with us. We've obviously got Leo himself. Do you want to give everyone a wave, Leo? Who is the co-author of the book, professor at York University and general doyen of socialist strategy. We have Lotte Boumelha, who is the chair of North West Young Labour and former volunteer on both of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaigns. Lotte, do you want to give everyone a wave? I don't know where Lotte is, but hopefully we'll find her soon. Andrew Murray is the Chief of Staff at Unite the Union, former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, and author of The Rise and Fall of the British Left, which a link to which you should be able to see in the chat soon.
It was a fall and rise.
Sorry?
It was a fall and rise.
Sorry, fall and rise. The wrong way around. I know that. I've read it and it's excellent, by the way. Zarah Sultana, who is the new MP for Coventry South and who is making waves in Parliament. It's very exciting to see her getting into Westminster and doing her thing. Do you want to give everyone a wave, Zarah? And James Schneider, the co-founder of Momentum and former head of strategic communications and former spokesperson for Jeremy Corbyn. Do you want to give everyone a wave? He's a bit slow on the internet there. And obviously, last but definitely not least, John McDonnell, the People's Shadow Chancellor, well, the People's former Shadow Chancellor, but Shadow Chancellor in all of our hearts. Can you give us a wave, John? There we go. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Leo, who's going to talk a little bit about the book for about 15 minutes. And then we're going to go to our panel, who are going to talk for about 7 minutes each, and then we will open up to the audience questions. So, Leo, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you very much, Grace. Well, first of all, let me thank everyone who has been involved in making this online launch happen. James, Max Shanley, Grace, Ronan, all those people from Momentum and Tribune and Verso, not least Catherine Smiles at Verso, who was originally planning a launch in London for this evening, April 18th, at Houseman's Books. It had already been booked, and I must say I was very sorry not to be able to be there in London to launch the book, to see so many friends and comrades and hug them and so on. On the other hand, to see these many hundreds of people who could never have fit into Houseman's without causing a appalling health hazard, even apart from the pandemic, it's really quite wonderful to have this online launch. Now, you could say it's very timely, the publication of this book and the launch just some 2 weeks after Jeremy's stepping down as leader and replacement as leader. And just a week after the leak of the Labour Party report, which shows the appalling role of such a significant section of the party apparatus, and the lengths it went, perhaps even to the extent of denying a victory in the 2017 election in opposition to the new Labour New Left's leadership of the Labour Party. So you may say it's timely, but I have to say that, in fact, the book was supposed to have been launched originally in time for the Labour Party conference last year in September 2019. And the main thing that held it back were political developments through the course of last year. And we put off delivering the final chapter, chapter 13, which is now called The Brexit Conjuncture and Corbyn's Defeat, until, of course, after the December election. The final manuscript then, the last chapter, didn't reach Verso until January 10th. And I have to particularly thank our editor, John Merrick, and the production people under Mark Martin of Verso for being able to get the book out so quickly and yet of such quality so quickly, given the delay. Now, in another sense, the book would have been out earlier, except it became a much bigger project than Colin and I perhaps initially intended. When I look back at what was the origins of this book, what was the seed of it, I think I, and Colin would agree, would have to again thank Max Shanley. Out of the blue, at some point, probably in 2013, I received an email from a Max Shanley, who I'd never heard of, telling me that he had become close with Tony Benn in the last year of his life, and that he wanted to take me out to dinner the next time I came to London. And I contacted him when I did, and he took me, believe it or not, to the Gay Hussar, the Hungarian restaurant in Soho, that has a certain provenance in Labour Party circles. Brought along a young friend of his, Barnaby Rain. I didn't let them pay for the dinner as they intended, and opened my eyes to which had been largely closed, to the emergence of a new generation of very young people who, long before Jeremy's election as leader, had begun again the project of the Labour New Left, intending to take it further and in new ways, defined themselves as Bennites. And I obviously found this very interesting because Colin's in my book, The End of Parliamentary Socialism, which began with the observation that social democratic parties, like communist parties by the 1960s, had run their course as agents of transformative social change. Had nevertheless given a great deal of credit to those people inside the communist parties, like the Euro-communists, and especially inside the Social Democratic Party, who had taken the explosion of activism and of militancy and of movement building of the 1960s into their parties. And the most impressive of those, we argued, in The End of Parliamentary Socialism, was the decade-long attempt to take the Labour Party from the reforms of the immediate post-war period to a socialist alternative in the face of not only the crisis, the capitalist crisis of the 70s, but the tremendous disappointments with the Wilson and Callaghan governments of the 60s and 70s. And the conclusion we came to at the end of Parliamentary Socialism was, while admiring that attempt enormously, the defeat of it, and the defeat of it had paved the way to the third way, to New Labour, to Blairism. The book was published in 1997, just as Labour was elected. The conclusion we came to was that the story we had told had indeed proved, excuse me, that the Labour Party would not be the path through which socialism in Britain would pass. That Ralph Miliband had largely been right to have said, albeit in passing, in the mid-1970s, that the greatest illusion that socialists in Britain succumbed to was that the Labour Party might become the instrument of socialist advance. Well, that looked confirmed through the early part of the 21st century. I must say that when Max Shanley called me, I was observing what was going on with the defeat of the attempt to undertake socialist advance in Greece against the European Union alternative. I received a call from Max Shanley House. Germany is just not nominated for the leadership of the Labour Party. He has got enough MPs and MEPs votes to be nominated. And I said, that's marvelous. He was trembling with excitement. I said, you know, he can't win. Well, it just showed you what I knew. And the seed of the book began then because Colin and I began to try to figure out what had happened between the time the end of parliamentary socialism was published and Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader through the summer of 2015. The book became something much bigger than what we had originally intended, which was a new edition of the end of parliamentary socialism, which would carry the story up to Corbyn's leadership. In fact, it became clear to us that in addition to trying to explain how Corbyn's leadership was rooted in the New Left of the 1970s, it became clear to us that we needed to provide a much fuller account of what effect Blairism had on the party, the extent to which internal party democracy had been stifled, that plurality, ideological plurality in the party had been stifled, and above all, what the embrace of neoliberal globalization by the third way leadership had entailed in terms of enveloping the Labour Party in the contradictions of this globalized capitalism, which, of course, was proven by the 2008 financial crisis. So that was one thing that involved a much bigger project than we had intended. A second was to actually figure out what had been going on in the first decade of the 21st century and under Ed Miliband's leadership as well, which marked a break with New Labour, that laid the basis for Corbyn's remarkable victory in the 2015 election campaign, identifying the importance of the shift to the left in some of the union leaderships, the importance of the anti-war struggle in Britain, which was perhaps the largest in the Western world, the importance of the anti-austerity movements, the importance of the socialist campaign group staying in the party rather than leaving the party to try a realignment in the formation of a new one. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, and this is what the last three chapters of the book are about, trying to look at both the possibilities and the limitations of trying to develop a strategy for socialist advance through the Labour Party, even when the leader of the party was part of that project. Looking at the continuing enormous barriers as well as the possibilities that this creates. Now, you know, one needs to remember that when Jeremy was nominated and started making his first speeches in June and even running into July, his main theme was that I am running because we are trying to show that we are a force, and I'm quoting him, we are a presence, we are a hope, we are an inspiration to the next generation. The leadership campaign was largely designed to show that the left was still there and relevant, and above all, capable of inspiring a new generation of socialists in the 21st century. Little was it thought at that time that Jeremy would win. And it has to be said that even as experienced a stalwart as John Lansman, who of course played an absolutely central role in that campaign, wrote on the eve of the 2015 election, just a year before, in relation to Tony Benn dying, declaring himself a Bennite. This was in Left Futures, and trying to lay out a program for the Labour left in the coming years. You know, talked about the need to link trade union activists with party activists, talked about the need to reestablish momentum at the constituency party level, talked about the need to take young Labour away from the type of undemocratic careerists that have been exposed in the recent leaks. Electing a socialist as leader of the Labour Party was not on his list. And Ben Sellers, one of the founders of Red Labour, which played such a crucial role in establishing the social media base of Jeremy's victory, and indeed the social media base of Momentum eventually. You know, in 2018, even after how well the party had done in the 2017 election, said, you know, if you had asked me even 5 years ago what we needed to do, I would have said we needed to start at the level of the CLPs, revitalize them, and then carry that forward upward in the party, with electing a socialist as leader being the last step. And we did this back to front. Well, we need to now look back at the consequences, good and bad, of having done this back to front. And if the book does make some contribution, I think, in terms of what now needs to be done, I hope it makes that contribution most in terms of a sober reflection on what was achieved under Jeremy's leadership, and what the limitations were, not only those imposed by, of course, the tremendous array of forces institutionalized inside the state, in the capitalist class, in the international balance of forces, but the barriers inside the party that remained even after Jeremy's election, and the consequences of what was achieved that would allow this now to be carried forward, but also the consequences of the fact that we now have a new leader and a new leadership, which, to put it mildly, is not enthused about the project of the Labour Party becoming a vehicle for socialist transformation. I want to say that I think the book stresses something that needs to be stressed very much, that we need to remember how well the Corbyn-led Labour Party did in the 2017 election. And we need to remember, in the face of the defeat of 2019, that we need to find particular explanations for why the success of 2017 was not carried forward. And it has very much to do, we believe, with the Brexit conjuncture, and the limitations forced upon the party, forced upon the leadership above all, especially by way of entrapping it in the Westminster bubble in the context of the minefield in the last year of parliamentary deadlock. And Jeremy was forced, and the leadership was largely forced, to look inward inside Westminster rather than outward to the project of political education, political mobilization, political development. I'll just conclude with this. The legacy of what happened is this. The generation that carried the Labour New Left to Jeremy's victory in 2015 and to the development of the most, I think, radical and coherent democratic socialist program that we've seen for many, many decades coming out of a social democratic party. That generation has now passed the torch to the new generation that it mobilized and enthused. And it seems to Colin and I that that new generation has something very rich as an inheritance. And that is the institutional legacy, as well as the policy legacy that Jeremy's leadership left behind. Above all, Momentum and the World Transformed. The greatest risk now would be to lose that institutional foundation. The greatest requirement is that institutional foundation now become much more oriented to entering into the constituency labor parties at the base, engaging in a process of political mobilization and education at that level, turning itself from being very successful as a campaigning organization for Jeremy and as a fundraising organization to that end, turning itself into the type of organization which is generating the types of organizers who built the working class in the first place, turning Labour Party branches into centers of community life. There are really no shortcuts to the long struggle for socialism. And I'm enthused at the extent to which people of the new generation understand so well the immensity of the task before them, that it isn't just a matter of reselecting MPs, that the problem goes much, much deeper in terms of the structures of the party and the way they're enveloped in the structures of the British state. The way they understand, and I think this is crucial, that without a democratization of the trade unions and without a mobilization of the trade union activists into turning Labour Party branches into centers of working class life, the task they set themselves will not be able to continue. I think it will, because I think they have this understanding. I'll leave it with that.
Grace, are you off mute? We can't hear you. It says you're not muted. Hold on, let me try to, there we go, hold on one sec. No. There we go. Oh no, sorry, no. Hold on, don't you press it, let me try that. No, one sec, let me try to do it. Let me try to do it from here. Speak now.
now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay. Great. Right. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Leo. We've now got like more than 500 people on this call from all over the UK, as well as from Australia, Canada, the US, and like all over Europe. So this is amazing and like a brilliant audience. There are also a lot of comments on how lovely your voice is, Leo, which I completely concur with. The other thing I have to say is that there is currently a 50% off on the book on the Verso website. So if you just go to bit.ly/Verso50, that'll take you straight to the site to be able to buy it. There's been a lot of love for Verso in the chat and all the brilliant books they're publishing at the moment. So they've obviously got this book, they've had published Andrew's book, and I have a book coming out that I've edited with a bunch of amazing contributions, including from James, and an interview with Leo called Futures of Socialism. That will be coming out soon. So yeah, one final thing, people who aren't on the panel, if you can turn off your cameras so to free up some bandwidth, and keep asking your questions in the group chat. So I am now going to hand over to Lotte, who is going to talk for about 10 minutes. You there, Lotte?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am chair of North West Young Labour, and I'm chair of Manchester Labour Students, and I'm going to be talking a little bit today about Young Labour, which is currently, without a doubt, the most radical wing of the Labour Party, but also the future of the Young Labour project. You know, there's many issues that we need to face in the post-Corbyn era. And when talking about Young Labour today, I think it's impossible not to talk about the contents of last week's leaked report. This report vindicated what so many of us had thought and had witnessed on countless occasions, of party staffers actively seeking and succeeding to stitch up elections for their mates on the right. You know, we've seen this from the 2016 Young Labour conference in Scarborough to last year's elections in Labour students, and we've seen the left fall short in elections for no other reason than corruption. And this report laid bare how, for many staff, the word that's possibly feared even more than socialism is democracy. But now with the abolition of Knowles and with OMOV election across the board in Young Labour, we can restart the discussion on what a democratic and an autonomous Young Labour should look like. So the last few years, we saw the rise of this enthused youth wing on the back of the Corbyn surge. And now we have almost 100,000 members, but to sustain this is going to be incredibly difficult in the face of a change of tack to moderate policies. And in the face of this, Young Labour needs to be an organisationally strong and robust body that can educate and agitate and organise its young members in their workplaces and in their communities up and down the country. And Young Labour National Committee recently have been doing really incredible Zoom calls, which are a really good example of this. These Zoom calls have been touching on topics from employment rights to housing, and you know, they're virtual meetings which have provided members with the tools to take on their bosses and take on their landlords. You know, it's fantastic work, but this kind of work we need to be extending and sharing with our local groups, you know, post Zoom and post Corona. So after the lockdown, there's going to be this big push to create and re-establish Young Labour groups, Young Labour branches essentially, because they need to be reconstituted to the new rulebook. And this is a heavy load of work, but it also brings up the opportunity to reassess the purpose of these groups and how we're supposed to be supporting them at a national level. So not only, of course, should these groups be feeding into the wider structure of both the party and of National Young Labour, but they should be becoming hubs of communities. You know, we should be giving them the tools for organising reading groups and film screenings and food bank collections and providing sessions themselves on how to organise in workplaces and take on landlords. But how do we do this at a national level? Well, we need to be continuing to push our resources and our autonomy. You know, currently the staff responsible for the organisation is hired by the NEC, and so is accountable to the NEC and not to the committee, which, you know, we need the staff member accountable to the committee if we're going to have an autonomous body. You know, the other thing is that the organisation right now, we have no money going to any of our local groups. The organisation must be given money from members' subs if we're actually going to develop our groups. And, you know, there's been loads of calls recently to push for greater representation of Young Labour, representation on the National Executive Committee, which I think holds huge legitimacy. And the introduction of any of these moves would be a huge step and a really necessary step if we are to develop and expand our organisation. So Max Shanley has recently written a really, really good document called Towards a New Model of Young Labour, and I recommend everyone reading it. And in it, he states that to encourage others to think differently is the most socialist act of all. Anything less serves the creation of a passive and stale movement, and that is not the movement we need. And I think what's clear is that by rolling out widespread political education and autonomy within our local groups, we will not only be sustaining our membership, but we will be advancing our movement. So before 2015, many in our movement saw our sole purpose as winning battles in stuffy back rooms and failing to understand why the less political culture didn't appeal to people. And then that changed with Corbyn, who brought hope and inspiration back to our politics. And I think we can't go back to the days before. We need to learn from the successes of groups like Manchester Momentum and use it as a model for other organisations of the left. So here in Manchester, we organise raves and rambles and reading groups because countering the lethargy and exhaustion that is symptomatic of neoliberalism has to be priority before we can develop a political movement. And a few of my comrades may be wincing at that. There's been this heavy debate between those who prioritise creating an energised political culture and those who prioritise getting people involved with the structures of the party. And of course, the goal is maturing our young members into soldiers of the party who know the rule book back to front and who understand the structure of the party and the mechanisms and are active and dedicated to their CLP, but there needs to be a balance of both of them. In Young Labour, we also need to be learning these lessons. So, you know, young people, whether they're students, whether they're workers, they're tired, you know, with poor wages, mounting debt, insecure employment, young people's motivation to be attending these meetings will inevitably be low. And you couple that with the likely moderation of our policy platform, and you know, we can understand why so many members are becoming disenfranchised and are starting to turn their back on the Labour Party. And if we don't adapt and infuse our strong size, membership is going to dwindle. And, you know, indeed across the board, at a time when we desperately we're needing this insurgent left to be setting the tone of debate around coronavirus, we're instead mulling over our recent defeats. And in the strange situation of lockdown, you know, we're confined to the geography of our homes, and we really need to dust ourselves down and pick ourselves up again. Because more than any other time in recent history, the meaning of solidarity and the meaning of comradeship is vital, and this is being translated to every single household across the country. You know, as our healthcare workers are working round the clock to save lives and putting their own lives at risk, our movement must be the vehicle for their voice, and our structures need to reflect this. And in practice, you know, this means having transparent processes to make policy and greater decentralisation of decision making. In the conclusion, or the not conclusion as it's asserted in Leo and Colin's book, they mention how even if Jeremy won, the Labour left had achieved at best a tenuous counter-hegemony. You know, this is essential. If we're assessing the failures of the last few years, we cannot forget about the failure to implement any form of political education across the party and the implication that this has had. Education is so often the centre of hegemony, and moving forward, we need to remember that. So across Young Labour, you know, as we move into this new political era for the party, we're not going to give up on our battle to democratise and to educate. And despite our losses, the struggle for socialism continues, and Young Labour will be playing an active and leading role in that struggle. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you so much, Lotte. That was, yeah, amazing, really inspiring. What an amazing call to action.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm just going to repeat for those of you who've just joined again. If you want to buy Colin and Leo's book from the Verso website, go to bit.ly/Verso50 and continue to ask your questions in the chat. And I am now going to hand over to Andrew Murray, who's going to talk to us for about 10 minutes. And you can also buy his book, The Fall and Rise of the British Left, on the Verso website. Andrew, are you there? No. There we go. Got you. James, you need to unmute Andrew.
Hold on.
Can you hear me
Yes.
now?
Yes. Andrew?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Well, thank you, Grace. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to join this panel today. Obviously, I'd like to, first of all, congratulate Leo and Colin on the book. It's an outstanding survey of how we got to where we are, and I certainly can vouch for its accuracy on the many political passages it described that I was involved in. Of course, I mean, I know, having had a book called Fall and Rise of the British Left that came out just before December 2019, I know that timing is everything in getting books out. And of course, since Leo and Colin wrote their book, there's been two really major developments. One is the coronavirus, and the other is the revelations regarding the activities of the Labour Party apparatus in the 2017 general election. Revelations which only are a part of a much larger report showing how the apparatus in that period utterly failed to deal with complaints about anti-Semitism. And that's a conclusion that some of the people that complained most about anti-Semitism of the Labour Party are most unwilling to hear. But I was brought into the 2017 election campaign, I think at the initiative of John McDonnell largely, to try and overcome some of the difficulties that were being encountered with the officials that I've described. I would have to say, however, I had, while I obviously knew that they were not supporters of Jeremy's leadership, I had no idea of the extent of the antipathy that some of the messages reveal. However, I think it's important to say that if there were officials who were behaving as described, it's because they were empowered to do so by the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party at the time. Without the sort of cover given by the hostility of the majority of Labour MPs towards Jeremy and John and the leadership of the party, I don't believe that they could have conducted themselves in the way that they did. And I mention that because I think it strikes to the heart of what Corbynism is. Now, Jeremy very typically, modestly said after the general election, there is no such thing as Corbynism, there is only socialism. And at a certain extent, that is absolutely true. But we have to look at what was novel about the time of Jeremy's leadership. Really, one could say Jeremy and John's leadership of the Labour Party. And it was precisely, for me, the most significant thing was not the policy advances, although they're real, and I think some of them will be enduring, but it was about how there was this shift in the balance of authority in the party from the PLP to the wider membership. or to put it a different way, the Corbyn leadership represented for the first time in Labour's history, and this is something Tony Benn reached for but never fully attained, where the parliamentary leadership in Jeremy and John and their comrades and the mass movement outside were actually united and in a symbiotic, mutually enforcing relationship. That, as I think Leo said in his remarks, that reflected both developments in the trade unions, and I work for Unite, which was central to that. It reflects the importance of the anti-war and the anti-austerity movements, and the fact that Jeremy, in particular in the anti-war movement, John in the anti-austerity movement, as well as Jeremy, had been absolutely central to those movements, had actually seen the axis of their work as being mainly outside Parliament, and how when we had them in the leadership of the PLP, you had someone like Jeremy who was happy to go to the demonstrations against Donald Trump. You had someone like John who would turn up on trade union picket lines, something the parliamentary leadership had always run a mile from. I mean, Ed Miliband did turn up at one TUC demonstration. He looked very nervous, like he'd swallowed a rat or something. So this was a new dynamic. And I think it is that dynamic, rather than the specific policies, that made one say that a Corbyn-led government, despite all the enormous obstacles it would have faced within the PLP, within the state, within the establishment and the City of London and so on, would have created a possibility of an opening towards socialism. That, I think, is what is now changed with the election of Keir Starmer. I mean, a Labour government under Keir Starmer will be 100 times better than the government we have at the moment. And Keir has said he will stick with the policies. However, that relationship with the mass movement, that isn't there. This is a restoration of parliamentary business as usual to that extent. And I think the game we have to try and hold on to is, above all, is strengthening the party and its membership and the trade unions relative to the hegemony of the PLP, the consequences of which Leo, Colin, and before them Ralph Miliband have traced in detail. And when they ask, is it the end of parliamentary socialism? Of course, the truth is there's never been a beginning to parliamentary socialism. And when I look back on the period of Jeremy's leadership, I still think the most significant single event after Jeremy had been elected was the defeat of the PLP coup in 2016. Because here was a situation where the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the great majority, said, we want to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, and the movement outside said, you can't, you won't, and they didn't. And that is never, because whatever the rules of a Labour Party have said before, the PLP has always called the shots. That was the first time that wasn't true anymore. And I think that gain is something that we have to find a way to hold on to going forward. I sort of agree with Leo's conclusion to his book that really, or what I think is his conclusion, that this isn't the moment for reviving the old argument about whether we should be in the Labour Party or forming a different party. A few years ago, I did write that there's an old truth, that the only thing harder than changing the Labour Party is building an alternative to it. But I think the events of the last few years have shown that the locus of socialist activity is and will be the Labour Party. In the period of Jeremy's leadership, roughly 400,000 people must have joined the party. Now, the largest of the parties set up to compete with the Labour Party to the left in the new Labour years maybe attracted 1% as many people. Momentum alone had about 40,000 members. I don't know what it has now. This is a huge resource. And as Leo said, there is a new generation coming through here, and that is what is, for me, fantastically encouraging. New people, and I take Lotte's point about the need for political education there, and that was a weakness, I think, in recent years. It's something I would have liked to have seen Momentum do more of. But I think there is, there is that potential and that possibility. But I think if we're looking on a broader canvas of the result of the December 2019 general election, I think in answer to the question, what happened after 2017, I think, you know, 3/4 of the answer is probably around Brexit. But Brexit itself as an issue speaks to wider problems about the disintegration of working class politics. In the literal sense, it is no longer integral. It is flying apart in different directions. We could see that happening in Scotland before Brexit or Jeremy were even on the scene. Jeremy wasn't on the scene as party leader, I mean. So I think the reconstitution of the working class as a political and social actor, the reconstitution of the class in the Marxist sense, I would say, is really an urgent and compelling issue. I think the coronavirus crisis will have a big impact there when it goes through the wash, and we see who has benefited from this crisis, who has suffered the most from it, what the causes of it are, how it prolongs what's already been a 10-year economic slump into one now stretching into the indefinite future. This has to be a moment where the ideas that Jeremy and John have championed become more, not less relevant. I don't think we should be ashamed to be saying that, but also where the constitution of the working class as part of that, the reconstitution of socialism as a political imperative, I can see all that being on the agenda. So despite the slightly bleak circumstances right now, I'm very optimistic that the advances we've recorded, the struggles we've had, the gains we've made over the last 5 years are going to have a lasting impact. I mean, let me echo, I think, what Lotte was saying, that for goodness sake, let's not turn inwards as a left at this moment. Let's not have, you know, prioritize forward momentum or standstill momentum or this federation on the left or that. There are millions of people who desperately need socialist answers out there right now in the midst of this enormous crisis, which comes on top of the previous enormous crisis that hadn't really finished anyway. So let's get to work on that front. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. A brilliant summary of the challenges that we've faced over the last several years and what we need to do moving forward. Someone said in the chat, why weren't you on TV up against Mar and Morgan more? Which I think is a question. I personally would have liked to have seen that. Right, so we're now going to move on to the woman, the legend, Zarah Sultana. Are you there, Zarah? Zarah?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are. Yeah, we can. Great. I'll hand over to you.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me on here. Thank you to everyone who's taken time out of their day to join us. I'm Zarah Sultana, the Member of Parliament for Coventry South, and it's a great privilege to speak amongst some amazing comrades, and it's a really important time for us to be thinking, theorising, reflecting on where we are and where to go. So I'm really proud to offer some thoughts on that. I'm really pleased that Leo and Colin have this new book, and thank you to the organisers for organising this launch. So what I'm going to do is just briefly talk about what's next for socialists within the Labour Party. Firstly, there's no denying that the past 6 months, if not longer, have been incredibly difficult for the socialist left. But with the coronavirus crisis that we currently face, as well as the looming existential threat we face by the climate catastrophe and a resurgent far right, it could not be more important for us to come together and keep fighting within the party, but also in our communities and in our workplaces. And while it's a really dispiriting time, like Andrew has said, of how much we have gained and how far we've shifted the debate. In 2015, which feels like a lifetime ago, we went into the general election opposing Tory austerity, but not austerity itself. We promised to reduce tuition fees, but not scrap them. And we pandered to Tory myths on immigration with control on immigration mugs, and we vowed to be tougher than the Tories on social security cuts. That's within, living memory. So let's remember that when the leadership election kicked off that summer, the right said we had lost the election because we were too left-wing. They said that we needed to celebrate wealth creators and return to the aspirational new Labour year. And even the ultra-leftist Andy Burnham launched his Labour leadership pitch from the headquarters of a global accountancy firm to prove his pro-business credentials. This is where we were in 2015. And after a mild leftward turn by Ed Miliband, the right of the party were determined to retake control and reestablish their hegemony. And if it wasn't for Jeremy Corbyn, they probably would have. Now, of course, we didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve with Jeremy's leadership, but we transformed the landscape within the party. And even though our leader now is not from the left, like Andrew has also said, he has committed himself to the 10 public ownership pledges, including ending the privatization of rail, mail, water, and more. So we, collectively, the movement, has put socialist ideas into the mainstream. And we've got a new generation of committed socialists. That is not nothing. Important advances have been made, but that's not to understate the challenges we face ahead. We know that the new leadership will face huge pressure from inside the party and outside to abandon socialist politics. We saw what they did to Jeremy. And if the leaked report from last weekend is right, the hostility is even directed by people within the party in senior positions who are against policies like raising corporation tax and bringing the railways into public ownership. There seems to be senior people within the party and the movement who think that these are absurd, Trotskyist ideas. They seem to have preferred a conservative government to one led by Jeremy Corbyn that would have worked in the interests of the 99%. The contents of this report have to be fully independently investigated, and as a member of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs, I support the calls for justice and accountability for our members. And in the years ahead, the Socialist Campaign Group has a huge role to play in terms of defending and advancing our socialist principles, to give our class anti-racist politics a voice in Parliament and nationally. And the crisis we face means that this is more important than ever before. We've seen how the coronavirus pandemic has shown how fragile the free market is. It has shown how capitalists rely on the state when they need it. And we're going to be soon at a crossroads, because when we emerge from this crisis, we're going to face two radically different paths. We saw in 2008, when the bankers crashed the economy, they ran to the state for help, and then the working class paid for a decade. But in 1945, the working class insisted that if we could house and care for everyone in crisis, then we could definitely do it in peacetime. It's up to us to shape what path we want to take. And as socialists and as the Labour Party and as a movement, this is what we should be saying, that this crisis has shown that the state can intervene to protect living standards. So let's do that all the time, not just in emergencies. It has shown the harm of hoarding. So let's break the power of billionaires who hoard society's wealth. It has shown the unfairness of jacking up prices. So let's end the pharmaceutical racket and bring that vital industry into public ownership. It has shown that we can house the homeless. So let's ensure that no one sleeps rough ever again. And it has shown more clearly than ever that cuts have consequences. So let's never underfund our NHS again. And importantly, it's shown that society is absolutely nothing without the working class. So let's build a society that is run by and for our class in all of our diversity. Tony Benn once said that although the Labour Party isn't a socialist party, it has always had socialists in it. And I think we might begin to feel this more in the months and years to come. But if we're serious about transforming society, we can neither abandon the party or our socialism. And it's because of Jeremy, John, Diane, and others that the torch of socialism was kept alive in the party through decades of difficult struggle. And as a new member of the PLP, I can truly see how difficult that struggle has been, just a tiny bit. It's because of their hard work and their fighting, constant struggle, that we came within a whisker of a socialist, anti-imperialist in Downing Street. And our task is to fight for that opportunity again, to learn from the mistakes that we made, but to be better prepared for when it comes again. It's not easy. We don't call it a struggle for nothing, but the challenges we face, the threats and the dangers mean that we have no time to despair. We have no time to retreat. Moderation will not cut it, only socialism will. So solidarity, comrades, let's keep fighting.
Yes, there is no final victory as there is no final defeat. Amazing, amazing speech there, Zarah. Thanks so much for joining us. James Schneider will now be speaking for about 10 minutes, who co-founded Momentum, has been working for Jeremy, working very, very hard for Jeremy for a long time. And yeah, he's going to be talking a little bit about, well, he's actually just written a piece for the book I talked about earlier, Futures of Socialism, which is a collection of essays that will be coming out soon, reflecting on his experience working for Jeremy and talking a little bit about socialist strategy for the future. So he is going to be talking to us now. Are you there, James?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. So I've written this essay, which is called Bridging the Gap, Corbynism After Corbyn, which, I mean, it doesn't answer the question. Obviously, we can't answer the question of exactly what next, but it tries to look at that a little bit. And I start it with that quote that Andrew Murray said, "There is no such thing as Corbynism, there is socialism, there is social justice," that Jeremy said the day after the election defeat in December, in sort of typically modest fashion, sitting in Islington Town Hall. But we all know that something absolutely massive has happened in the last 5 years, and we've got so much to build on. And let's not forget how far we came. I mean, you know, 2015 took everybody hugely by surprise. John was saying after the 2015 general election defeat that it was the darkest hour socialist Britain had faced since 1951. I walked in pretty much off the street to volunteer on the campaign because I had 2 weeks off work, and I thought I would obviously just go straight back to work after 2 weeks, and it would be a good thing to have done. But you know, it wasn't really going to get anywhere. And so, you know, I think that we won not because we were incredibly well developed, that our progressive forces in the UK, the trade union movement, the peace movement, the anti-racist movement, feminist movement, green movement, anti-austerity, all the rest of it, not because they were particularly strong, even though the campaign was an expression of them and dragged in all of those talents and energy under one umbrella, but instead it demonstrated the fragility of our opponents, the systemic frailties after the financial crisis, which was starting to work its way through the political system. And I'm sure you all remember where you were and what was going on the 12th of September 2015 when Jeremy won. And he said at the end of his speech, which I still think that ending of his speech is maybe the best thing he said, where he said, "We don't have to be unequal, it doesn't have to be unfair, things can and they will change." And I remember being full of hope when he said that, because it was announcing that we were allowed to hope again, but it also showed a weakness, because it's not clear who's going to do the changing. And I think that showed what the central challenge was for the whole Corbyn project, was that yes, the whole system was struggling to reproduce itself, but we weren't the cause. Between the possibility created by this systemic fragility and the relative weakness of progressive forces was a gap. There's a gap between how weak them breaking down and how strong we were. And that's where Corbynism sat in the middle, I think. And the whole job for the leadership, for Jeremy, for John, and for everyone else, including Momentum, was to try to hold on to that gap as long as possible, hold on to the leadership against all the hostility, and try to build up the progressive social forces in society so that we would be in more of a position to have a socialist advance. And of course, this was going to be incredibly difficult, not just because we'd had 40 years of defeat and society had been fundamentally reshaped, but as this report, the leaked report shows, the scale of hostility from Labour's anti-socialists and of course the media and of course the rest of the ruling class was unbelievably extreme. And I think that report is shocking, but it should be clarifying for us. I think we should use it as an educational moment so we really know what it is that we're up against if we're trying to build for a sustainable socialist advance in this country. I remember John Matt used to say a lot about being in and against the state. But I mean, first of all, we had to be in and against the party, and I think that's a useful concept to continue. But because conflict in the party, yes, we want to have we want to have unity and we want to win, of course. But also conflict in the party can help to organise us. That is what happens, I think, in 2016 in the anti-socialist failed coup. I think Andrew Murray is absolutely right that it showed that the PLP doesn't have a veto on where the party as a whole is going. And that campaign, I think, was actually wonderful. I mean, it really strengthened and educated a whole load of our people and brought us all together. And I think in some ways laid the groundwork for the later advance the next year in the general election, which was really, of course, the big leap forward where policy after policy became completely mainstream. We were allowed to talk about public ownership and taxing the rich and scrapping tuition fees and scrapping anti-trade union laws and all the rest of it. And that did strengthen us. That gap that existed between the weakness in the system and the weakness of our forces was closed substantially through those two advances, the advance in the party in 2016 and the advance in the country in 2017. I won't go through everything, of course, that happened 2017 to 19, but we were in a stronger position as a movement as a whole, I think, inside and outside the party in 2019 than 2017 or 2015. And you saw that straight away in the campaign, where a huge number of people were mobilised by the bits of the party machine that weren't hostile to Jeremy's leadership and to socialism and by Momentum. I mean, it was really, really impressive. I mean, so when we got to electoral mobilisation, the movement was strong, but I think we all have to accept that in some ways the leadership and we were all involved in that, we'd run out of steam and were rather worn down, and we've been fractured apart by Brexit, which gave the establishment this wedge to drive into the heart of our project. And they did so again and again and again, often using parts of the party, parts of the liberal establishment that has purchase in the party and purchase with some of our members to do that. So by 2019, Jeremy had lost his room for manoeuvre. We were divided about how to move forward. And so the burnish of 2017, when Jeremy was there in the election, where he looked like a politician apart, entirely authentic and relaxed, was painfully wiped away. We could just compare the two elections. In 2017, we were able to centre a class antagonism and offer popular policies. And in 2019, we just weren't. Even though we won 10.3 million votes, I know this is it's the fewest number of seats since 1935, but it's more than Labour got in 5 of the last 10 general elections. So this big discrepancy can be explained primarily again by Brexit, because Johnson's Conservatives, I think, brutally and effectively dominated the right side of politics by purging Conservatives who were squeamish about their Brexit strategy and cajoling the Brexit Party to stand down. And that cohered their coalition and it splintered ours. So now, with Jeremy's leadership over, when the party's not going to immediately return to just offering tepid social reform, but we know it's not going to fight, the leadership is not going to fight for socialism, that's going to be up to us. Keir is not a ghoulish neoliberal or a reactionary authoritarian. He doesn't love war, but he doesn't seem to be a socialist either. And so we're going to have to be very strong in order to put pressure on him. But this shouldn't cause us despair. I mean, as Leo and Colin's fantastic book, which I hope everybody buys with the Verso link discount, the Labour Party is not and has never been a socialist party. But what we've had for the last 4.5 years is that socialist leadership has provided a project for power to bring together all the progressive forces to work in that direction. And so I think our challenge now, the challenge for this movement that has been brought together in this last 5 years is, yes, to keep growing. It's not just defend what we've won, it's to keep growing and to pull roughly in the same direction. And yes, that will be difficult, because after the compressed focus of the Corbyn era, of Jeremy's leadership, a great number of strategies will re-emerge. People will want to do different things. We're already seeing that starting to happen. And that process will prove messy, and we will see some sectarianism and some cultural differences. But I think that a multiplicity of strategies doesn't need to be divisive. In fact, it is necessary, because right now it's not entirely clear what the path forward for a sustainable socialist advance is. But the one thing that we do know is that if we apply the Labour theory of value, the more people are doing the more things, moving in the same direction, keeping open possibilities, will be in a good place to advance when the next moment arises. So people will do their activism in all sorts of different places, some in trade unions, some in community organising, some in anti-racist work, some in climate emergency, some fighting in CLP after CLP to get delegates to conference to hold the shadow cabinet to account and to push forward more socialist policies. But this is a good thing, I think, as long as these different strands don't butt against each other too much and broadly run in the same direction and have some coordination, we'll be in a good position. And here I hope that Momentum could play an important role, but it really will have to change and evolve for it to do that. There needs to be a process of renewal and re-democratization after 5 years of really defending the party leadership. But I think it could articulate a socialist strategy, or it should articulate a social strategy in the party and in society, and connect with all the different organising efforts. So I think that our movement, we're quite developed now. After 5 years, we're hugely stronger than we were before, and I think we can succeed, we can advance, we can come together if we show that we are mature, that we have tolerance for diversity, we're internally generous, and we're really committed to the long haul, because this is going to be a very long haul, always has been, always will be. Because Jeremy's leadership was never going to bring socialism itself, even if we'd won a majority government. This moment was a spark, it's an organiser, a staging post, and it's up to us, all of us as the movement, to take forward the cause and to win further advances. And that way, we can prove Jeremy right, that there is no such thing as Corbynism, there is socialism, and things can and they will change. Thanks.
Thanks so much, James. Brilliant. And remember to check out James's piece called Occupying the Gap, I think, on the Verso website, which is going to be in our book Futures of Socialism, but it's also up on the Verso website right now. So now I'm going to hand over to a man who needs absolutely no introduction, John McDonnell. John McDonnell.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. It's been really fascinating. It's been really interesting, and it's good to be able to just sit back and think through what's been happening over the last few years, and also to talk to comrades about where we go from here. And can I just say, Leo and Colin, thanks for the book, and also just thanks for your work consistently over the years. This can get a bit anecdotal, but so forgive me, and I'll try and refer a bit to what people have said. Leo said the issue about putting the cart before the horse. The plan in all of our planning on the left for the last 20, 30 years, from Tony Benn onwards, when Tony was no longer in government or on the front bench, all our planning was how can we develop a left that can build the membership, build a movement that will eventually get us into government. But we knew it would be the long haul, and no one said achieving socialism would be easy, especially in the belly of the beast of the founding nation of capitalism, effectively. So way back in, and it seems a long time ago now, but way back in 2010, most of you know, Jeremy and I argued we shouldn't run a candidate for the Labour leadership because we didn't think we had the resources to get a respectable vote even, and that would demoralise the left for another generation. And we argued, we convened meetings not to appeal to the left, not to run a candidate. And I think at that point in time, we thought, well, the best tactical advantage might be to swing behind Andy Burnham or someone like that and see if we could negotiate something around that on policy or in position. Anyway, the wisdom of crowds prevailed, and the large numbers of Labour Party members and socialists said, don't be ridiculous, you've got to run a candidate. And at that point I said, well, okay, we can run a candidate, but we'll most probably not get on the ballot paper. So, but maybe we'll have a fortnight of getting on the sofas of the main TV stations and the main chat shows. And then, as you know, we decided on a candidate on the basis of Diane had already done it once, didn't want to do it again. I'd done it twice and was so popular I couldn't even get on the ballot paper. So Jeremy, we volunteered him. He didn't volunteer, we volunteered him basically. And then we worked hard, and John Langsman was key to this in getting Jeremy on the ballot paper. We worked for days to secure the nomination, and many of you are involved in this in talking through constituency parties to put pressure on Labour MPs, and we begged, stole and borrowed nominations to get him on that ballot paper. I'll give you an anecdote which I've never said before, which was on the Sunday before the Monday close of nominations, we packed in, John and I, with our team, and it was about 6 o'clock. We thought, we can't do any more. We've done everything we can. It'll be left in the morning now. And I went off to the Globe to watch a Shakespeare play. I can't remember what it was, but one of those ones where there's lots of bodies on the stage at the end of it. And in the interval, I got a text from Seb Corbyn, and in the interval, I phoned Seb, and he said, my dad's having second thoughts. He's really worried. And it was Jeremy's Garden of Gethsemane moment. Should I, and bless, I love the man. And he had said to Seb, I'm worried. He didn't want to let the left down. That's the first thing. But also he said, well, what if we win? What if we win? And I said to Seb, look, don't tell him not to worry about that, because the security forces will assassinate him before he gets anywhere but coming and going into number 10. So calm down. And that was it. We had joked about it, and then I went and watched the rest of the play. And then the next morning at lunchtime, we got him on the ballot paper. And at that stage, actually, we weren't putting, on Leo's point, we weren't putting the cart before the horse, because the strategy then was if we could get about 25% of the vote, it would be a huge victory, would have mobilized and start building much more of a social movement on the left, a rank and file base revitalized, both in terms of Labour Party membership supporters, but also in the trade union movement. And also what we were trying to do is draw in all those groups that we'd been working with in different campaigns. So on the tax campaign, all the young people involved in UK Uncut, on some of the occupations, some of the squatters movements, that sort of thing. So all of those groups. And of course, exactly as Andrew said, the heroic work that Andrew and others put in with Jeremy on the Stop the War movement, it was all around trying to mobilize those people and bring them into the party. And we thought, if we got about 25% of the vote, well, we'd have built a mass base that we could work from. We'd given people confidence. And at that point in time, we thought, well, we might have been able to negotiate maybe a couple of left from the Socialist Campaign Group into junior ministerial positions. bag carriers to bag carriers, if you like, just to demonstrate that we were willing to go into government at any time. Because it was a serious venture that we wanted to demonstrate the left could go into government. But it was about building a mass social movement to taking the first stages on that. We did that to a certain extent in terms of we built a mass base, and as James Schneider has said, it was an unbelievable campaign of people flooding forward. And the reason it was successful is that they flooded forward with their political commitment, but also a huge amount of creativity and talent, and bringing forward political interventions that we hadn't even thought of. You know, the way in which the development of policy rapidly within a sort of a 6-week period, across a whole spectrum of policy. And it just demonstrated to me, actually, if you do bring people together and they're enthused, my God, the creativity that comes out of it, it was fantastic. And James and others brought forward their expertise in terms of how we handle the media. And the mainstream media, first of all, the best thing they did was ignore us or ridicule us, so that gave us a free rein. And then when they realized we were a serious threat, of course, they started coming for us, but they'd run out of time a bit, but also the professionalism. And we need professionalism on the left. The people like James Schneider and others being able to manage that, demonstrated to our own people, gave them confidence that no matter what they threw at us, we could turn it around or we could overcome it. And so that's what I think the lesson of that first leadership campaign was, that actually we were about building a movement, and we were about making sure that we transformed into a social movement, but also that it was on the basis of a professional approach to every activity that we undertake, drawing in new skills, etc. We did, as a result of the development of policy, it was a bit of a political education process as well, because groups were emerging on different aspects of policy, talking through ideas. We were publishing them. And I think if, James, you'll have to correct me, I think one policy paper we put up on the web on one day, we had 50,000 responses in something like 48 hours. It was unbelievable, the number of people who want to get engaged in the debate and discussion. So it was an education for all of us. And there was areas of policy with new ideas coming through that I actually, again, for me, the whole breakthrough on climate change in particular, for me, was really significant, the way that we debated it as well. But also people coming forward about real detail about how we can implement housing policies in different ways, etc. So that was the process that we were going through. Once we won, then it really happened, really. And the issue for us, and I think people need to realize this, and this isn't an excuse, this is just a mitigating factor. Every day was a coup. Every day was a challenge. And this leaked report, if it's true, we knew roughly that this sort of level of opposition was taking place, but to experience it was extraordinary. And it was significant threats on a daily basis within the Parliamentary Labour Party and within the bureaucracy, but also all of that minor dragging you down, you know, making a decision, never input. And remember, we never had control of the National Executive Committee for the first couple of years either. So decisions we were making either not implemented or diverted, that sort of thing. And it was a tough struggle. It was a hell of a tough struggle. And I just pay tribute to all those individuals who stuck with us throughout, those individual members of the Parliament as well, the elements of the PLP that supported us. But every Parliamentary Labour Party meeting, every Monday, if Jeremy attended, it was a bear pit. It really was. And there was behaviour that in ordinary meetings of the party or elsewhere, any other organisation would not be tolerated in a trade union branch or anything like that. But that's what was thrown with us. And then we went through the major coup, but there were coups on a regular basis. And I agree with what's been said, really. That enabled us actually to recruit even more people and engage even more people. But remember what this leaked report went into as well, which is factually true, is that actually they even tried through bureaucratic measures to try and keep Jeremy off the ballot paper itself, even to be able to go into that second leadership election. But what that did, and James is right, it strengthened us, and it gave us a real sense of being able to say to the Parliamentary Labour Party, this has to settle now, we have to get on with it. And then that's what ran us into the 2017 election, which was so close to success. And it was based upon, first of all, real skillful management of the campaign as best we could control it. And I do put that down to Andrew Murray. It was me who said, we need someone like Andrew in here. We needed people who knew what they were doing, along with Seamus and others sitting down, planning it through. What we didn't know in 2017 fully was that there was if the Leeds report is true, there was an alternative operation going on to virtually prevent us going into government, which was remarkable. And we did come so close. And the point I made about the coronavirus crisis this week is that actually we would have been 3 years into a Labour government. We would have had a fully funded NHS. The nurses and health workers we clap every Thursday in the care, they would have had their pay rise that the Tories blocked. And then also we would have been 3 years into the implementation of a national care service that we desperately need now. And it would have been under democratic public control and ownership, managed by the workers themselves. So that loss of that Labour government at that point in time had a material effect on how we deal with this current crisis itself. We ran into the 2019 election and Brexit, it's contingency really. Brexit became the issue and we got dragged into parliamentary mechanisms. And I think it's right, we got trapped with the Westminster bubble. I spoke to Leo some time ago, and one of the things his book, which dealt with Syriza and all the rest of it, one of the issues was what we weren't doing is building the mass movement even further, training cadres who could then nourish the development of activity and political debate within the party. And the political education, although the World Transformed came about, which was fantastic, a magnificent organisation, the work that they've done, it was quite late in the day. And we have to admit it as well, we were fighting for resources to fund the mass activity. It took us 2.5 years to get the community organisers in place because systematically it was blocked by head office, the HQ, just to get the money, to get the recruitment done, to get the right people on the ground. And it certainly wasn't done on the scale that we wanted, but it was every day was a fight to try and control and get things done and move forward. But if we have to be honest with ourselves as well. We got trapped in the parliamentary bubble. My big concern at the time, as people seem to forget this, around the EU discussion, was that we were faced with a potential split of the Parliamentary Labour Party on some scale. You know, it wasn't just Chuka Umunna and the small band with Anna Soubry. At one point, I was worried we were potentially up to losing about 70 Labour MPs. So we had to try, yes, and there was a bit of triangulation just to keep the PLP together because we would have been faced with an even more difficult circumstance. But that did undermine, I think, our credibility with our own membership and with working people, in particular in the North and other Leave constituencies, but also it just undermined our ability to get on with the job of arguing the other policies. I think we have to be honest, though, we failed to get an overall narrative as a result of that diversion. That's the contingency element. So we need to look back on then and look to the future and learn those lessons. And the lessons for me as well is that we allowed our own movement, our own project to become bureaucratized too. So by being trapped in the Westminster bubble, instead of having mass engagement and mass involvement in decision making, it was centralized and became quite bureaucratic. And we have to admit that. We have to admit that, because if we don't admit our mistakes, we won't learn for the future. What now? Well, let me just relate it to the coronavirus position, and we've had this discussion in other fora as well. My view now is that the tragedy of this crisis leads people to learn some lessons about what's gone on. And it's same in another meeting, when Boris Johnson started making all these wartime allusions, trying to build himself up in this Winston Churchill. What he forgot is actually in the Second World War, people came together and they wanted a different future. And actually they didn't want Winston Churchill at the end of the war, because what they've been doing, even the darkest hours of the Second World War, they'd looked back on the 1930s and said, never again. And then they started dreaming and discussing and planning the sort of society they wanted after the Second World War. I think that's what we should be doing now, looking back on the last decade of austerity and saying never again, because never again should we allow austerity to be imposed upon us, so working people have to suffer as a result of the banking crisis out of their control, and never again do we allow public services ever to be run down in this way, so we haven't got the resilience to deal with crises, and never again should we allow individuals to be forced into such a situation, even in this crisis where they're having to choose between health and going to work and avoiding the financial hardship that's hitting them because of low pay and precarious work. And at the same time, what we should be doing is talking about the sort of society that we want. And people are learning lessons from this crisis about the sort of society we want. Individualism now is no longer a solution. The solutions are collective. What that means is that what we have to do is look at how we develop our economic policies on the basis of a fair decision system, on the basis, yes, of appropriate monetary policy as well, that we make sure we have a public services properly funded, and that we look at the range of the way we democratize our economy through public ownership, but also the level of the firm as well, where we introduce an element of worker democracy as well, so that people can't be abused in the way they are being in this crisis by being forced to work, or employers using the crisis to sack people or cut their wages. I think people are learning a lot of lessons. Now, what we've got to do during this period is talk through those lessons with people, of course, develop a programmatic approach to the sort of policies that we want, but more importantly, recognize that we've got to build upon what we've got now by way of a mass movement, largest political party in Europe, and that means learning the lessons of our failures during that last 5 years. So insufficient investment in political education, that's where we've got to go. Secondly, in terms of how we communicate our policies more effectively, both in how we deal with the mainstream media, but how we develop our own alternative media. We did it in 2017 with social media. I think we failed in 2019 to keep the pace up of that, but also how we use the whole range of cultural engagements that we can to develop our message across, recruit people, and just build the movement overall. So as a result of all of this discussions and just listening to people today, I think, it is the old Gramsci thing, pessimism and intellect, optimism with a will. I actually am more optimistic now than certainly since December. I think the more people that are coming together, as Lotte has said, in terms of young people, there's the potential of a mass movement amongst young people being mobilized, I think is really significant. But also it's interesting, the publication of the report, people are going two ways. Some people are saying, oh, that's a completely disillusioned, leaving the party. That's true, there's some like that. The bigger reaction I'm finding is people bloody angry and saying, this is our party, we'll never let this happen again. We want to democratize it. What are the mechanisms for democratizing it? And how do we go forward? So I think we've got to use this report for, again, to help us in that mass mobilization, but also in the radical reform of the way our party operates. So this is a process now to the next stage of democratization. Keir Starmer as the newly elected leader, what we shouldn't go into from the left is sort of opposition for opposition's sake. We should engage with the new leadership as best we can, build upon the manifestos that we had in 2017, 2019. When the right start mobilizing to tear some of that up, we've got to mobilize, and on the mass numbers that we've got, we should be able to do that. And I think on the basis of working alongside the trade union movement in particular, we've got the resources now that actually could take us to the next level of the debate about what sort of society we want and the socialist solutions to the issues that we now face. I'll shut up on this point as well. I tell you too, and whatever you think, the Socialist Campaign Group, exactly as Sarah said now, we've got a larger membership than we've had maybe for the last 20 years. We've got new members come in like Zara, Nadia and others who are just brilliant. And it just inspires the way they speak, the commitment that they've got, and also the class backgrounds that they come from too. We've got the same sort of things going on within our union movement, but also we've got trade unions and others that are taking on the concrete issues, particularly around those hardest hit within our society, those in precarious work, etc. So every time we talk about our analysis of society and we come up with a policy program to actually address the issues, it's got to be linked to direct activity as well, whether it's on industrial action, whether it's demonstrations, whether it's occupations or whatever. We've got to be campaigning for those policies and those changes by working alongside people, community by community, struggle by struggle. So I think there's a lot to be said about this next period in which we could take the movement to the next stage in the struggle for socialism in this country. There is no alternative. Thanks, Grace. Thanks
so much, John. My little brother just came into the room while you were talking and said, "Are you on Zoom to John McDonnell?" He was extremely impressed. Right, we're going to go. Okay, actually, no, firstly, I'm just going to say to anyone who's joined late or hasn't heard me say it yet, again, you can buy Colin and Leo's book on the Verso website if you go to bit.ly/Verso50, and you get 50% off at the moment as well, which is amazing. So I am now going to go to questions. We've been doing our best to kind of collate the questions that people have been sending in the chat, but it's been going very quickly. So if, you've got a question that doesn't come up, please just carry on posting them in the chat, and we will try and get to them. So there's one here from Harriet Street, and I'm going to just give this to the whole panel because it's not addressed to anyone in particular. During the leadership and deputy leadership campaigns, there was talk of democratising the Labour Party, giving members a say, open selections, etc. The candidates making these arguments weren't elected. Socialists in the party, this was an issue, but after Labour leaks, it's clear the party needs a democracy review more than we ever anticipated. How do we deal with this going forward? And what is the best way for us as members to push for fair socialist representation? So I'll go to James, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think the democracy review was unfortunately a bit of a flop. And there are two aspects to it. One is to do with rule changes, and I think we didn't do enough when we could, and now we should organise to push further. Yes, for open selections, but for a whole range of things. But I think there's another aspect of democratising the party, which I don't think we've done terribly well on in the last 5 years. In fact, this might be the thing that we've done the least well on, which is changing the kind of culture and practices at the local party level. I think that at the moment we still don't encourage people to do their political activism and to do their organising in their communities, and too much of local party life is geared towards a monthly meeting that's quite dry, as opposed to working with trade unions, trying to organise tenants or whatever things people want to do. So I think there is quite a large opportunity in the next phase, especially given that all of the left activists, we're not going to have to be trying to defend the leadership. We can experiment with all sorts of different types of organising in our communities, in our workplaces, and try to link that into our local parties and change the culture of our local parties that way as well.
Great, so I'll go to Leo, then Zara, and if anyone else on the panel wants to chip in on this question, please do, about democratising the party.
Yes, I think it's the question to be asking, but democratizing in a way that's deeper than reselection, although obviously that's very basic, and deeper than getting resolutions passed at party conference and having a PLP that pays attention to them. Democratizing the party needs to be oriented to developing the capacities of party members and party branches to contribute to the very difficult task of developing socialist strategy in an effective way. It was the end of parliamentary socialism, in fact. The Labour Party did represent parliamentary socialism. That's why Ralph Miliband called it that. It had a commitment to the social ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. in clause 4. Most of the parliamentary leadership, for the most part, didn't put much emphasis on that. But what they did put a lot of emphasis on was their particular capacity, once they were elected as representatives, to carry policy through. And what that neglected always was the deep structures of the capitalist state, especially the ancient undemocratic constitution of the British state, but it also neglected the party's lack of interest or capacity to develop the membership, to develop the capacity of party branches to win support for the difficult struggles, the difficult conflict that would be faced, the sacrifices that would need to be made when a radical strategy was introduced. And I think that in that sense, we came closest to getting back. Of course, the Blair New Labour people dropped the socialism part of that entirely, even before the 97 election. And socialists were entirely marginalized, if not oppressed in that party led by New Labour. I think we came close to getting back to parliamentary socialism under Jeremy's leadership, and that was a problem. And I think John was speaking to this. Getting trapped in the Westminster bubble reflected that problem. And it meant that the strategic orientation to how do we implement what I think was a very admirable set of policies, both in terms of how to change the state, which John above all always tried to engage with members in. I mean, it was very impressive how he would raise that openly. But not a lot of strategic attention was paid to how are we actually going to change the apparatus to get this done. But even more important, what was not done was how will we be able to mobilize support in the country when, you'll please excuse the expression, when the shit really hits the fan and we try to implement this. And in that sense, I think John's point that the leadership had to take the unity of the parliamentary party on its own shoulders. It's always the left that takes the unity of the party on its shoulders. Those in the party who are opposed to socialism will carry on opposing a socialist leadership up to the day of the election. They will never take the unity of the party on their shoulders. Michael Foot did against Tony Benn and the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy by the early 80s. And I do think that the current leadership, Jeremy's leadership, had to take that on their shoulders as well. At some point, the strategic question of do we carry forward with this socialist strategy, even if that involves losing a significant portion of the parliamentary leadership who are against socialism, needs to be addressed. And the unions are going to have to, with their obsession with union solidarity, with not upsetting one union leader by another union leader, are going to have to face that as well. That's the only way, I think, in the long run, that this will be seen through, because it will at some point entail a split away by those who are against the socialist project and against the democratizing project.
Great, thanks. I think Andrew wants to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important question about Labour Party democracy, but for me, it comes down to only one issue, given the history of the party and indeed where we are now, and that is about the control of the PLP by the wider movement. Now, obviously in the recent period, this sort of crystallised around the issue of open selections as against trigger ballots, and open selections were narrowly rejected, I think partly for the reason that John McDonnell outlined in another context about the fear of a massive hemorrhage of PLP members leaving the party and making electoral victory effectively impossible. But I think, in a sense, that is not the only way to look at the resolving this problem, because as I said in my opening remarks, this for me is the problem. If Labour is to move on, its parliamentary representatives have to be subordinate to the movement. Now, the idea that this is done solely through what used to be mandatory reselection, now open selection, I think is questionable. Because if we look at the trigger ballots that were introduced, in the end, I can't remember how many MPs it was, the constituencies voted to hold the trigger ballot, but in the end, none of them got deselected at all. I think the issue more has to be how the PLP is collectively subordinated to the rest of the movement. Now, I know it's very unfashionable and there are certainly weaknesses to point to Communist Party practice in the last century, but where Communist parties in Europe and elsewhere had parliamentary representation, substantial parliamentary representation, their parliamentary group was unequivocally subordinated to the Central Committee or whatever it was it wasn't a matter of parties exercise particular control. And I think that is something I can only should be explored going forward. You know, how the PLP can be collectively subordinated to the National Executive Committee of the party in some form or other.
Does anyone else want to come in on that question? No? Okay, cool. We have a question. No, someone? No? No one's coming. Okay, we have a question here from Rabia Khan. How will Labour win back the Leave seats lost in the 2019 general election? And if I go first to John on that question.
Okay, in the next general election when it comes, and I think we have to recognise that it's going to take the next at least 3 years. Although you never know on these things, but with a Tory 18 majority, they'll stick around, I think, for as long as possible. Except if they think they're really high in the polls still next year, then you never know, they might go for an early election. But we'll have to see. But it's likely to be about 3 years' time, maximum 4. Brexit then, I don't think, will be the issue that it was in 2019. A lot of those issues I think a lot of the issues around Brexit will be resolved for good or evil, to be honest. So that won't be the key thing. And the issue around Brexit was, it's historical contingency. It was an issue that they were able to mobilise around, and tactically it was virtually impossible for us, no matter what we did, whatever route we took, whether it was to back Leave, we would have alienated Remain supporters, and that was about 60 to 70% of our membership, and we would have lost seats if we'd have backed Remain wholeheartedly, and we would have been annihilated in Leave seats, and we were hit badly, even because we tried a compromise, and that looked like triangulation. That issue will largely be gone by then, but that's why this period over the next couple of years is absolutely critical. And I think the key period within that key period is the next 6 to 12 months as we come out of the coronavirus crisis, because that's the issue that will be confronting our people, and will be confronting in particular, as someone mentioned, this argument that this condition doesn't discriminate. Oh, yes, it does. It discriminates against working people, and particularly members of the BAME community, because the vulnerabilities that they have within our society, because of the way in which our society and our economy is organised. So I think in this coming period, we've got to be the ones that demonstrate how we learn the lessons from the coronavirus crisis, and then how we build the new society that we want, that is resilient not to any other future crisis like this, but also resilient from the day-to-day suffering that there was. And You know, we've got to remind people as well, you know, there were 700 people, homeless people who died on our streets last year. That was a crisis for them. There's 125,000 of our children being brought up who are homeless, brought up in temporary accommodation. It's a crisis for their families every day of the week as well. So I think what we've got to do is in this coming period demonstrate we're the leading force in society in terms of mobilizing people's views, ideas, future aspirations about the sort of society that we can create. I link that as well, that I think in coming out of the coronavirus crisis and trying to restructure our whole economy and our society, it has to be on the basis of confronting the other immediate crisis, which is climate change. And we need to get back to explaining to people again what the imminence of that as a crisis too.
Zarah, do you wanna come in on that? You there, Zarah?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay,
cool.
I've been unmuted. Just echoing what John has said about the next election, which won't be a Brexit election. Coronavirus has highlighted the deep structural inequalities in our society, whether you're a renter, whether you're having to go into work because you can't work from home, how the social security net fails so many people. It's completely and utterly inadequate. And it's about us being on the left and communicating those messages and talking about how this is actually something that has to change, and making sure that we're leading on those conversations. We need to therefore be advancing socialist politics and principles, uniting working people, making sure that we never lose the link with trade unions, working with tenants organisations and tenants unions, which are building, you know, all over the place. We've got a new Acorn branch setting up in Coventry, for example, and wherever we go and whatever we do, we're forwarding working people's interests. And I think coronavirus is really an opportunity to look at how society is not working.
Thanks, Zarah. Leo, did you want to come in on that? You're muted, Leo. You need to unmute yourself.
Trying to, there. But the question was posed in terms of how we're going to win back those constituencies that were lost. And I think while what John and Zarah just said is very important, and I think the relevance of both the 2017 and 2019 manifestos is so obviously clear in this crisis, in the sense of the need for manufacturing capacity. So the type of lack of ventilators and indeed tests, etc., you know, would not be there by virtue of a conversion of manufacturing to be able to produce those things, but also in terms of the Green New Deal and what that meant. It's very clear that the relevance of the party program under Jeremy and John's leadership is so confirmed in this crisis. But in order to be able to win those constituencies in the Midlands, in the North that were lost, one has to first of all recognize the extent to which the working class institutions that was the social base of Labour victories electorally have been so badly damaged and frayed. To some extent, the Blair leadership was itself interested in doing that. It was trying to present itself as a party that was not a class party. But what has happened in those constituency Labour parties is they reflect the decline of working class identity. They reflect the decline of trade unionism in those communities. You know, it used to be the case, for instance, that in the pub, it might be a Communist Party shop steward who would be the opinion leader, who would tie people to voting Labour, who would lead them to understand that the appeal of a xenophobic nationalism is not in their interest. That has to be reconstructed again. And in that sense, I think the most important page of the report that was leaked, and I just got it here, is page 68, where two regional staff organizers in October 2017 are quoted as saying they discussed Momentum's adverts for regional organizer positions in Momentum. And they noted how poorly they were going to be paid for doing this, right? And then they said, that said, even though they're going to be badly paid, they will be doing our job, but they'll be motivated. And one of them says, I think they will do the groundwork we cannot be arsed doing. And they will engage the members in a way we cannot be fucked with. I'm quoting them. They are going to be so motivated. That is at the core of the problem. Not the prejudice against trots, not the definition of all of us as whatever the hell that means, trots. It's the failure for the party to be organizers. Now, one has to say that same problem exists in the unions. And if the Labour Party is going to be a class party and is going to be able to do this, it not only needs momentum to play that role in eventually getting the party to play that role, the unions need to change themselves into being organizers again. And this must be said, changing the Labour Party into a vehicle of working class reformation cannot take place unless the unions at the base are part of that project in a way that they have not been able to be. And that applies even to those left-led unions.
Grace, could I just come back on that point, if I can? Because I completely concur with exactly what Leo has said. On the community organizer front, that they blocked their development and recruitment, as I say, for virtually 2.5 years. And we only got through, I think it was about 50 in the end. So nothing on the scale that we wanted. And they blocked them because it was a threat to the power of the regional officers and the bureaucracy that they faced. That's the first thing. The second is, and Zarah will come in on this one, all the work around the community organisers wasn't the traditional work of, just getting them people ready for an election, knocking on doors. It was about community campaigning. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the other thing as well, is actually working with a number of the unions, and Unite have been good at this. Unite community branches were incredibly effective in many areas. But the smaller unions, like IWGB on the precarious work campaigns, the bakers on the McDonald's campaign. So that sort of stuff, where unions have had a profile is around those sorts of areas of work. But what's interesting at the moment, where in many areas we don't have that sort of trade union structure as on the scale we used to have with active trades councils, what's interesting, new structures are emerging largely in the voluntary sector. And what I've been doing CLP meetings, every other Saturday we were doing town meetings talking about the local economy, etc. But it's interesting, the coronavirus crisis, it is Labour Party members who are populating the voluntary sector that are rising to the challenge of the coronavirus. So alongside the sort of traditional organisational forms of trade unions and the local party branches, etc., we are now, I think, and the Labour Party are populating that whole voluntary sector area. And that again gives us the opportunity then, like as Zarah has referred to, Acorn and places, issues like housing and other issues like that. We've now got new organisational forms that we can, well, not only use to tackle the particular problem, but use them then to evolve the debate and discussion about what socialist practice is all about at the local as well as at the national level.
Right, I've got a question here for Lotte, which is that we've seen a mass mobilisation of young people in the youth climate strikes. How should Young Labour be engaging with this movement post-lockdown? How can we engage environmentalist young people in the Labour movement and develop their politics in an eco-socialist direction?
Good question. Right, well, Extinction Rebellion, I think there's a lot of legitimate criticisms for them, but you've got to give it to them. They pulled off an incredible feat, putting climate change onto all of our agendas. And it's hugely young movement, but hugely a middle class movement, and you know, very legitimate criticisms that they targeted their action, you know, largely at working people, and you know, in doing so alienated the working classes. So I think young Labour and the Labour Party have a huge role to play in, you know, directing that to who really is causing our climate change, you know, big businesses and such. Like the Labour Party has been somewhat separate to this movement, and I think a lot of young members of Extinction Rebellion have felt really disenfused from us by our criticisms, and I think we need to be a lot more open to them being a part of our structures. So again, I think this is a case of political education. We need our young Labour groups to be inviting them onto our platforms and to be making links with these groups ourselves, because you know, the Corbyn surge was one thing, but we've seen a whole nother layer of young people be inspired by climate campaign activism. And, you know, we've yet to really delve into the roots of this as a party. You know, Becky Long-Bailey's incredible manifesto on Green Industrial Revolution is definitely something that we need to take to our young Labour groups and flesh out more of what that actually means, of working with trades unions to, you know, target climate change. Yeah, it's, again, like I was saying, I think young Labour really haven't been the leading voice in this as much as we could have had. And again, I think it's just making the relationships with Extinction Rebellion that we've yet to do, and becoming a leading voice in climate change ourselves.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lotte. So the next question is, if the left managed to recruit and mobilise so many people for Corbyn, why did it disintegrate in the recent leadership election? And why did Rebecca Long-Bailey get only a small number of votes? Tough question.
Grace, your internet's gone a bit funny.
Can't hear you, Grace.
Oh. Well.
Oh, sorry, that was me. My video froze. My fault.
Who do you want to answer the question?
You go, seeing as you're speaking now, and then we'll go to Leo.
I really walked into that.
Sorry, I couldn't hear anything that you said. My video froze for like 5 minutes, so just talk, guys.
So I think there was a lot of understandable demoralisation after the defeat in December, which made the path to victory for Becky or for any left candidate narrower, but I think still possible. But Keir got out the blocks very fast, and he had a great first month of his campaign. And we've got to remember that you know, whereas probably most people who've watched, most participants in this Zoom and everybody on and certainly everybody on speaking considers themselves a socialist and has socialist politics. Lots of people that are big supporters of Jeremy within the Labour Party don't have as well developed socialist politics, and so we're easier to peel off in Keir's very well pitched campaign. So I think that's part of it. I think Keir pulled away the kind of softer part of Jeremy's coalition, and Becky's campaign didn't really get started for the first month. So Keir got moving, Becky didn't, and I think the left really needed to be picked up after the defeat, and someone charged forward and lead the way. And because we had a sort of month of sort of quiet where we were just all miserable, I think that put us basically in the, you know, starting far too far back by the time the campaign kicked off. I throw to John, as you're not muted.
Okay, let me give you this analysis. I think Leo was going to come in, but let me go historically on this. For those of us who remember 92, I was a Labour candidate in 92. I lost by 54 votes in my constituency that I eventually won and I represent now. And we came out of the 92 election campaign suddenly sort of demoralised because everyone thought we'd win in 92. And then Thatcher resigned, Major took over, and he was able then to secure electoral victory. What then happened is that John Smith was elected leader, and John Smith was sort of centre-right, but actually everyone respected him. I had an awful lot of time for him. He was just a very decent person, and he's sort of traditional Labour, and you'd put him in the sort of Attlee mode, something along like that anyway, very traditional Harold Wilson type Labour, but not seen as on the left. But the one thing he's very solidly Labour, and when people like Jack Straw came along to him, said we to junk clause 4 and all that, he just threw him out, full stop. And he also, after he became leader, he threw out Peter Mandelson and all that crew, basically. John Smith then died. And what happened is that we'd just lost an election. We'd lost the Labour leader that everyone had an awful lot of affection for, and the party was actually disoriented. And so they then went into a leadership election, and they chose, and this was it really, it was because they thought, well, what do we do? A large number of people thought, well, we need a winner. So what does a winner look like? Well, it looks like the traditional Tory Prime Minister, which is a lawyer, white, middle class, in a suit. And so as a result of that, really it was almost defeatism. They chose Tony Blair, and that was it, basically. I think we went through a very similar thing after the defeat in December, which was a lot of party members came out really demoralised and thought we can't lose another election. And we still have that sort of I'm a working class person. A lot of people, we still have deep in us, it's almost psychological, a still sort of fall-up-togging mentality to the middle class. And I think what happened was a large number of people in the party thought, well, we want to select a winner. What does a winner look like? A lawyer, white, middle class in a suit. And that's, I think, how many people oriented themselves towards Keir. And in terms of and Keir, you know, I had to give him his due. He put a hell of a good campaign together, incredibly well resourced, an awful lot of money went into it. And there's issues about that too. But also he'd been touring around the country for quite a bit, for quite a period in terms of speaking to constituency parties, etc. So he had laid the foundations for a future campaign if necessary. And Becky's campaign, exactly as James said, got off for a very halting start, and that was because I think she was in the negotiations with Angie Rayner, so that Angie didn't run for leader, but she ran as deputy, that sort of thing. And to be frank, let's be honest, the campaign, Becky worked incredibly hard, and James and a number of others did as well, but it just never took off. It just never took off. And interestingly enough as well, the media barrage on Becky was horrendous. It was building up. It was almost they transferred their attention from Jeremy onto Becky. And it wasn't just the Mail and the Sun and all the rest of it. But I always say to people, the most damaging newspaper for the Labour left is The Guardian, actually, because it's our people who read it. And it's, again, it sows invidiously attacks on the left continuously, and particularly on the comment pages by some of their major commentators. And they turned their attention onto Becky. So she had an incredibly tough time. I thought she did pretty well in terms of the overall campaign, but you have to recognise sometimes what you're up against, and that was it. The key thing now, though, is to recognise that We've got a number of left still in the shadow cabinet and still in ministerial positions. We need to support them. We shouldn't get into any sort of aggressive struggles with the new leadership. Our thing is we want to support them to get a Labour government. Of course we do, but we want to support them in a way we win the argument about policy and how we mobilise and campaign for that. But people like Becky and Andy MacDonald and Cat Smith and Marsha Cordova, who are the left in the shadow cabinet now, need our support too. And so that's exactly what we should be doing now, and building their profiles and building their campaigning capacity.
Andrew, do you want to come in on that at all? Oh, sorry, Leo and then Andrew.
I'm waiting to be unmuted.
You're unmuted.
Oh, good. Okay. I really would rather ask a question rather than pretend I have an answer to it. And that is, to what extent did Starmer's support for a second referendum factor in his attractiveness to those young supporters of Jeremy, who also supported Remain rather than leave? And it kind of picks up a point James was making. I was on a platform at the last Labour Party conference, a Young Labour and Unite joint meeting, and we recount this in the book actually, with McCluskey. And there were about 100, 150 young people in the room, and McCluskey turned on them at one point and said, "What are you? Are you Remainers? Are you Leavers? Or are you Socialists?" And almost as a person, they all got up and applauded with great enthusiasm to be able to define themselves as socialists. But I wonder how deep that was. And this raises the question of what kind of political education did Momentum do? How effective was the TWT beyond the fringe meetings that organized at conference, or the festival, the marvelous festival that organized at conference? To what extent was there enough political development going on amongst those people who mobilized, young people especially, who were mobilized behind Jeremy, joined Momentum, etc.?
I can answer the point about young people. The answer is no. From the internal polling on Becky's campaign, the younger people were more likely to support Becky. Younger party members were more likely to support Becky. Her support did skew in the same way that Bernie Sanders' support skews towards the younger and towards those on lower incomes.
The issue in the election, though, looking back on the leadership election, what I was staggered at was the numbers of people who didn't vote at all. And that, I think, reflects demoralization after the general election and people not picking themselves up fast enough. On the political education front, the more Leo raised it, the more I look back. And I can remember when we were trying to get the issue around the HQ was that appointments were largely controlled by those elements that we see in the report at the moment. And where we did get people into HQ in some roles, particularly around the political education or social media roles and all the rest of it, they became incredibly isolated. And then you hear stories about how, well, quite brutally that they were treated in that isolation. So you can see how the last thing the Labour Party wanted was any form of active political education role coming out of the headquarters. I think TWT, I agree, TWT is a great initiative, and we were talking with them last year about how they don't just become a event at conference, but more widely, right, and almost a daily occurrence all around the country, and we're trying to get resources in them for that. And that's exactly where they need to go now. And if we could have got the TWT simply being the Labour Party educator, it would have transformed things, I think, within a matter of a couple of years. But there was no way the existing bureaucracy was ever going to allow that. And Jenny herself, when Jenny was appointed General Secretary, immediately she was appointed, she encountered opposition within her own with her own, even within the building when she walked in. It was quite remarkable, really, how difficult it was for anyone we appointed into any position working within that HQ, and this report confines it all.
Right, so I will go on to the next question then, which is a question for Leo. So Leo, you've said in the past that smashing the state, brackets in the Leninist sense, is no longer a goal for the left in the UK, and nor should it be. Does this mean that there is no conceptual usefulness in spontaneity in relation to left transformational politics, and in particular in regards to the state?
Luxembourg.
No, there's room for spontaneity. There's certainly room for street mobilization. But the notion that you transform capitalism by smashing the state, or indeed that a transition to socialism involves doing away with the state, is, I think, harmfully misleading. In fact, the task before us needs to be how do we get into a state which is structurally capitalist in its very pores, and learn how to change it. Any complex society is going to require coordination, and indeed in the 21st century we desperately need democratic planning more than ever. This virus, this pandemic shows it in every state in the world, but of course the great ecological crisis that is a longer run one cannot possibly be addressed without democratic planning. So I simply think that the old insurrectionist notions, and I think the largely rhetorical ones that came out of the late 19th century about smashing the state, are not of a great deal of use. In terms of where to go with that, however, I think that the book quite a number of times makes the contrast between what happened in the party after the defeat of the Labour government in 1970 and what Jeremy Corbyn had available to him after the defeat of the Labour government after 2015. The National Executive Committee, led by Benn and Heffer, between 1970 and 1973 had 80 policy committees developing alternative policies, most of them oriented to different policy formats, but some of them oriented to how state apparatuses would have to be changed to implementing this. Jeremy had none of that. Of course, the whole National Policy Forum was created by Benn in order for there not to be that capacity inside the party apparatus. And it was not reconstructed. And this meant that virtually all policy development had to be done out of John's office. And yes, they did a lot and it was impressive. But the party hardly contributed at all. And I don't mean that just in terms of what other policies, in what way did the state need to be changed? And you need the type of party that is developing that question and party members' capacities to contribute to it. I have to say that I think a problem with spontaneity, with the movements, is they don't take that as their responsibility either. And you saw that very much with the Syriza government. They're very good at protesting outside of ministry office. But in terms of taking responsibility for how that ministry would need to change to be able to implement what they want, that is not something that the people who appear at in the protest movements seem to see as their responsibility. We have got to get past this.
Andrew, you indicated you want to come in there?
Sorry? Oh, sorry.
Did you say you wanted to come in there? You had your hand up.
Sorry, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear you there, Grace. Yes, I mean, I do think, I mean, of course, smashing the state is, as Leo said, a sort of 19th century or up to 1917 and not much further concept. And the idea of insurrection is purely fanciful. But I do think we need to take the question of the state very seriously, and the organised power that it would deploy. I mean, it's not much of a leap of imagination to consider the obstruction that the government led by Jeremy and John would have encountered. And I mean, I got rather pilloried a year or two ago for even referring to the existence of the deep state, the military and intelligence services and civil servants, and how they would not be well disposed towards a left-wing government, and how there would be all sorts of obstructions put in the way, undemocratic obstructions, to try and thwart even a stable parliamentary majority. So I think preparing for political confrontation with extra parliamentary centres of class power is an essential part of any thinking about socialism. It is not just a matter of electing a parliamentary majority or getting your policies right. You have to think about how you will mobilise forces around a left-wing government, forces on the streets, in the workplaces, in the communities, that can sustain that government and give it the muscle, if you like, to overcome what will be resistance from the state. And I don't often paraphrase Trotsky, but to paraphrase him, we may not be interested in the state, but the state is very interested in us. And if we have to, we have to think, I mean, as part of the preparation for confronting capitalism, as to how we confront its organised class power, as well as its economic power.
Thanks, Andrew. I will just ask the panel, does anyone on the panel have any questions for anyone else on the panel before we go to one last question? No? Okay. I'll go to one last question. Yeah, okay, I'll go to one last question. So how can we ensure that our policies remain on the books in years to come? And I'll go to every panelist on that one, maybe starting with Zarah.
Oh, okay, I'm muted. I think firstly, it's really important, given what we've seen with the leaked report, that people do not leave the party and continue to fight to ensure that the manifesto that we had in 2017 and 2019 is the manifesto to build on, and that they continue to organise within their CLPs and push forward the democratisation of the party. We don't know what's going to happen in the conference, but one thing I've just remembered that is super important are the upcoming NEC elections. And John's mentioned this in previous, in so many Zooms that I've lost count, but one of the biggest losses were the two NEC that we've just lost. And with the upcoming elections, we need to make sure that the left is unified and that we are pushing and electing socialists into because that's a key battleground. And that's what we need to prioritize. We need to come together to make sure that we win in the fights ahead until we get into power.
Thanks. So Lotte, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, there we go.
Great.
Yeah, well, of course, completely agree with what Zarah was saying. There's been many calls of people saying that they think they're going to leave the party now. This isn't the place for the left. And the Labour Party is the only place for the left. And you can't leave. And in fact, we haven't got Corbyn leading our voice anymore. So, the pressure's now on even more for us to get involved in our CLPs. I think we sort of lost this as our tool down the lines of the Corbyn project, and people became, less and less involved in the project of actually revitalising them. And it's so essential. Get involved in your CLPs, get involved in your trades union branches. Of course, we've got to unify behind Keir Starmer, but, it is for us to make sure that he is accountable to, keeping our manifesto at the centre of everything he does. And we can only keep him accountable, staying in the party and being a loud voice within our CLP. So it's about making sure that we stay at the heart of our structures, even if we have lost our leadership.
James?
I completely agree with Lotte and Zarah that we need to stay, unite and organise within the party. But also, I think we need to educate and organise in society so that our policies that we support, that we won within the party, become popular demands. That's the way that we will, with a pincer movement, get the leadership of the party to back the policies that we want. One, we are strong in the party and the NEC and conference and CLPs, everything, putting forward the policies, but that we show that there is a mass support for our policies in the country. And we do that by, yes, we organise in the party, but we get out and we organise in society with other progressive organisations that are doing things, so that our policies that we want, that are radical, are common sense to the majority of people, and that way we can drag the leadership of the party in a socialist direction.
Thanks. Andrew? Unmute, Andrew.
Yeah. I suppose there's two answers to the question. One is, if you look at the NHS, that's more than 70 years old now, and despite the Tories' best efforts and wishes, they haven't really destroyed its fundamental basis or ethos, because it works. It works for people, and it represents a sort of decommodification of one of the essentials of human society, health, and has been enormously popular, and its impact spreads across almost the whole of society. So it's now embedded, and it's very difficult even for right-wing Tories to find a way to undermine it. The other answer as to how you can keep your policies there over the years is to change the system of class power in the country. While you're in a capitalist society, no gains are permanent. Under a socialist society, what the NHS represents in the field of health could be extended to many other areas of life as well.
John, do you want to come in on that? Where is?
Trying to run. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm muted. Okay. We just win every argument. We just have to win every argument. We have to be everywhere. We have to mobilise and just be every place there's a discussion going on, whether it's in the party or outside the party. You win every argument. Simple as that. But also, we shouldn't limit ourselves to just defending the last two manifestos. If we stand still, we'll fail. We've got to be the people who come up with the next wave of radical policies. So you don't just build a defensive mechanism, you go forward. And I just think that the tragedy of coronavirus and its outbreak has opened people's minds up to actually thinking much more radically than it is. One sense of irony, I have to say as well, a lot of the right wing were having a pop at us for about free broadband and bringing it into public ownership, etc. It's probably one of the most popular policies during this period that anyone could think of. But again, what we do not stand still. Make that more radical. I want to be coming up with much more radical policies for the future, and then some of the right will be defending the 2019 manifesto as the status quo. And I think that's the way to do it. Just win every argument. Can I say about the lost leadership of me and Jeremy? We're not going away. We're not dead. We're actually going to involve ourselves in that debate. And you'll most probably get sick to death of seeing us both, because we'll be touring around trying to win the argument wherever we can. There's a few notes been coming up about, well, we've got hostile constituency parties. I think we should do analysis of where our strengths are, where our weaknesses are, not just in terms of the nature of the party, but also even geographically, so that we look at focus work on the ground as well to win the arguments in those particular areas. So as we win the argument for democracy in the party, we've got that mass base operating effectively all the time and not at every level. So yeah, win the argument, because that's what we're going to do.
I don't think I'm the only one extremely relieved to hear that we're not going to be seeing the end of either you or Jeremy, John. So yeah, Leo, can we finish with you?
Well, I think the parallel here is 1931 to 1945. After every major economic crisis that capitalism has gone through, the Labour Party has thrown up a person of the left, a socialist, as party leader. Lansbury, after 1931, after the Labour leadership, the Labour government embraced austerity and entered a national government, you had the radical pacifist socialist George Lansbury elected as leader of the Labour Party. Michael Foot eventually became leader of the Labour Party out of the crisis of the 70s. And although it took a little longer in the case of Jeremy, the effect of the 2008 crisis and the complete discrediting of New Labour as a result of it led to Jeremy's election. Why 1931 to 45 is so relevant here is that Lansbury resigned in 1935. Partly because he was a pacifist and the party embraced rearmament, and a much more responsible leadership emerged. It was that leadership which saw itself as much more centrist than Lansbury was, which kept the policies, the radical policies that were adopted by the party between 1931 and 35, largely kept them in place. And then when they were validated by the Second World War, all of the things that people said the state couldn't do in 1931, the state did with a vengeance, and much more, of course, during the war. And that validation led the much more responsible Labour leadership to largely introduce those policies of nationalization, the National Health Service, etc. That said, they introduced them in a way that did not maintain their transformative potential. As John often said in his wonderful speeches, even at party conference and certainly to the World Transformed when he was Chancellor, the nationalizations were crucial, but what they lost was the dimension of industrial democracy that had been so alive in the debates and the discussions in the labor movement in the 1930s. They were introduced, in other words, those nationalizations in such a way that the people who were working in those nationalized industries didn't see them as run any differently than they had been when they were privately owned. That's just one example. In other words, the deal done with capital around the introduction of those very major reforms, or as Bevan said it, you know, we got the National Health Service through by stuffing the doctors' mouths with gold. Those reforms involved the type of compromise with the existing powers that they did not become the kind of structural reforms that would develop people's confidence and indeed the leadership and party's capacities to figure out how to go beyond them, to get beyond capitalism. So it's not going to just be a matter of holding on to the policies. In fact, I think that this crisis already validates all of the Labour Party's policies, every single one of them, right? And I think it'll validate them in the public imagination, certainly. But they will have to be introduced in a way that opens up space for further, more radical reforms. And in that respect, I think this crisis points to the most important one that was not introduced under Jeremy's leadership. Jeremy, as we know, was a leading advocate of doing away with Britain's nuclear deterrent. Just at the time that a fortune is being spent on the renewal of Trident, the nuclear submarine. Right? That never became Labour Party policy. It didn't become Labour Party policy largely because the unions in that sector were not serious about conversion. And had they been serious about conversion, had they been talking, as the Lucas Aerospace workers did in the 70s, about turning the capacity of the shipbuilding skilled trades to produce medical equipment, look at the difference it could have made in this crisis. So again, we have to go beyond the policies. I agree with John, it's not a matter of standing pat, but it's ones that need to involve a change in the union leadership as much as in the party leadership, in the union membership as much as in the party membership.
Thank you so much, Leo, and thank you so much to everyone on this panel. This has been a really incredible discussion with like tons of amazing comments and contributions from everyone who's been watching as well. I'd just like to remind everyone that you can buy Searching for Socialism on Verso right now. It's 50% off if you go to bit.ly/Verso50. Buy the book, tell your friends about the book, not in person though, solely online. Spread it around Twitter, share it, and obviously read it, because it's a truly brilliant contribution. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And I hope to see some of you on Zoom calls where we are organising and putting into practice the things that we've learned today over the coming weeks. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.